You are listening to the Loida Lewis podcast, hosted by Loida Nicholas Lewis. She's a trailblazing businesswoman, leader, philanthropist, and the widow of Reginald F. Lewis, the visionary leader who was the first African American to build $1 billion company. With unparalleled determination, Loida Lewis has not only excelled as a successful attorney, but also shaped a $1 billion empire. Following the untimely passing of her husband, Reginald F. Lewis, she took the helm of TLC Beatrice, carving her legacy as a successful business leader. Be inspired and learn from her as she shares her wisdom, the secrets to her success in both business, in love, and in life. Let's live, love, laugh, and learn. With your host, Miss Loida Lewis.
Welcome to the Loida Lewis podcast, and today I have the honor of presenting to you the great-great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass and the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. And here he is, Dr. Kenneth Morris. Thank you very much, Dr. Morris,
Thank you for
being
having
here.
me. It's my honor to be here with you. Thank you.
Yes, it is a little not coincidental, but really wonderful that on two great African American heroes comes Dr. Kenneth Morris. So, how is it growing up having this descendants behind you?
That's a beautiful question. And there was never a time when someone sat me down and said, we've got something really important to tell you about your family. I just always knew. I spent all of my summers at Frederick Douglass's summer beach house on the shores of the Chesapeake Bay in a place called Highland Beach, Maryland, which was built by my great-great-grandfather, Charles Douglass, who was Frederick's youngest son. And Charles had purchased some acreage on the shores of the bay and wanted to build a retirement home for his father. So he asked his dad, are there any special features that you want in the house? And Frederick said, yes, I want it to sit right on the water. I want it to point in a certain direction. And then I want you to build a tower at the top. And what he wanted to do at the end of his life was to sit in that tower, look back across the water, and on the other side you can see land. And that is the eastern shore of Maryland, where he had been born into slavery with the name Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. And so my great-grandmother would tell me stories from that tower in that house and just really, talk about his life in slavery. And so it was just all around me. And I think I was probably about 5 or 6 when I started to notice that my ancestors were on statues, and they were on money and postage stamps, and schools were named for them, and bridges and libraries. And I would ask my classmates, are your grandparents on statues? Of course they were.
You were 5 years old.
5 or 6 years old. Uh-huh. And so I started to notice it, but it took me really a long time to really grow into my heritage and my legacy and to start to walk in my own shoes.
That's wonderful. So, for the audience, tell us a little bit of Frederick Douglass for those who have not studied history.
Well, he was born into slavery, as I mentioned, with the name Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. He only saw his mother a few times his whole life. That's because she lived on a plantation that was 12 miles away. He didn't know who his father was. It was presumed that it was his enslaver or his owner. He had 6 brothers and sisters that he had been separated from, so he truly, early in his life, was an orphan with no family, no home, and no country. But he had something that happened in his life that he wrote about in his first autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. There was an incident that happened that he described as divine providence in his favor. And that was he was chosen from among all of the children on the plantation on the eastern shore of Maryland to go to Baltimore City to be the house servant for his enslaver's family. And the importance of this move was he was leaving in an environment where he wasn't around people that could teach him how to read and write. Now he would be in the big city. He would be around free black children and poor white children. But what happened most importantly when he got there, his slave mistress, Sophia Auld, never had a slave before. She didn't know that it was illegal to teach him to read and write. She was already teaching her young son, Tommy, how to read. And right alongside Tommy was his playmate, Frederick. And he was bright-eyed and eager to learn. So out of the goodness of her Christian heart, she began to teach him his ABCs. And that was all he needed, was that little spark of light into his mental bondage. And the lessons would continue for a little while until his enslaver found out about him. His name was Hugh Auld. And when he found out about the lessons, he got angry. And he looked at his wife and he looked at Frederick and he said, "You cannot teach a slave how to read and write, because if you do, it will unfit him to be a slave." And I hope your audience heard that message, the power of education. It will unfit him to be a slave. And Frederick looked at his master and he thought, if you don't want me to have this, I'm going to do everything in my power to gain it. And he understood right then and there that knowledge is power, that education equals freedom, education equals liberation, education equals emancipation, and he would teach himself to read and write. And so just fast forwarding, he would teach himself by trading bread for reading lessons with the hungry children in the neighborhood, or he would pick up chalk and he would say, "Is this how you write an F?" And they would say, "No, Fred, this is how you write an F." And he would file it away. And as he's getting older, he's getting smarter, he's starting to think critically about his condition of enslavement. And he's asking questions like, why am I a slave? Why do you own me? How come you know your birthday and I don't know my birthday? And he would make his first attempt to escape from slavery when he was 18. Somebody told on him. So he was caught, he was thrown in jail for a couple of weeks. And then again, divine providence in his favor, his enslaver, instead of selling him down south, sent him back to Baltimore. And from Baltimore, he would escape on September 3rd, 1838, at the age of 20, with the help of my great-great-great-grandmother, Anna Murray Douglass, who sold her personal belongings to help finance his escape. She put together the sailor's disguise that he would wear, and then he would escape by train and by boat, come to New York City, write a letter back to Anna. She would come and join him 2 weeks later. They would get married, take on the name Frederick and Anna Johnson, and then it was suggested by conductors on the Underground Railroad, which is a network of people, places, and spaces working together to help freedom seekers run away. It was suggested that they go to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where Frederick could likely find work on the ship docks. He had acquired a skill as a ship caulker while working in Baltimore. And so 2 weeks later, they would land in New Bedford. And I am so proud of my family for so many things. I'm proud of the lessons that they've passed down, the love, the humility, the forgiveness. But what I think I'm most proud of at this time in their lives is that they were starting a family, and they could have just been happy to be in a northern state. And while Frederick was still what we would have called a fugitive slave at that time, we call those people freedom seekers now, they were not going to be happy as long as their brethren, their family, their friends were still in slavery. And so Frederick and Anna would attend an anti-slavery meeting on Nantucket Island, and he was asked to stand up and speak and just tell the audience about what it was like to be enslaved. And he writes in that autobiography again, he said, "I was so nervous that first time speaking in front of a white audience that I was shaking from every limb. But when he stood up, he had this natural gift for communication. He was eloquent, he was charismatic, he was theatrical. He was even funny in talking about some of the characters that he came into contact with while enslaved." And so William Lloyd Garrison, the white abolitionists, knew that they had a star in their hands. And so they asked Frederick to join the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society as a paid lecturer. And he would go from town to town, city to city, telling his story. And then he becomes an advisor to President Lincoln during the Civil War. After the Civil War, he is a founding father of the Second Republic during Reconstruction. He becomes the first African-American nominated for Vice President of the United States, first African-American U.S. Marshal, first African-American ambassador and consul general to Haiti, first African-American recorder of deeds in the District of Columbia, and the first African-American to have a statue dedicated in his honor in Rochester, New York in 1899, which was 4 years after he passed away. So that's kind of a summary of Frederick Douglass and who he was.
Oh my goodness gracious, what a storied life. So for those who are listening, there is this book that Frederick Douglass himself wrote. What is that again?
Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. It was first published in May of 1845. And the reason that he had to write it, as he's traveling around narrating his story, telling the public what it was like to be enslaved, he started to have a problem. And that problem was people started to doubt that he was who he claimed to be. They couldn't wrap their minds around what they thought a slave looked and sounded like and what they were seeing and hearing in this well-dressed, good-looking man. So they called him a fraud. In order to prove he was who he claimed to be, he wrote that first autobiography. After it was published, he had another problem. it became a bestseller. And that's the last thing that you want, is the notoriety of a best-selling book if you're trying to hide from your enslaver. It made him a household name, made him a celebrity, but he's now off as the leader and the spokesperson, the mouthpiece for the abolitionist movement.
By that time, wasn't there an effort by the South to bring back those who escaped?
Yes. So there were, in 1865, when the 13th Amendment was ratified and slavery was officially...
Okay, 13th Amendment, everyone.
To the Constitution.
Yes.
Which outlawed slavery, made slavery illegal. There were more than 4 million people that were freed, and there was really no plan for emancipation. These people really just had the clothes or the burlap on their backs. Many didn't know how to read and write. Most had been separated from their families, and some would just spend the first couple of years in freedom trying to reconnect with family members. There was no counseling. There was no post-traumatic stress disorder designation, so they were really fending for themselves. And so when you talk about the Underground Railroad, there were only about 100,000 documented cases out of those 4 million people of people that tried to run away. And typically, people were running away after the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law, which meant prior to that law, if you were escaping from a slave state like Kentucky, going across the Ohio River to a free state like Ohio, you could turn around and wave back to your master across the water, and they technically couldn't come and get you. But after that law was passed, it meant you had to go all the way to Canada if you were escaping from the Upper South. You had to go to Canada to get your freedom.
Oh, my God. One roadblock after another.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I want everyone to understand that Frederick Douglass said about education, learning how to read and write. You gave, can you just repeat it again? Education is...
Education equals freedom. Education equals liberation. And when I think about the story that I told with his slave mistress beginning to teach him to read, one of the other points that we always make when we talk to students about this story is that Frederick asked her to teach him. And I consider that his first moment of self-liberation, where he is one day going to be free. He doesn't know it yet at that time, but he's opening up his mind and he's praying to God and he's asking God, why does my master put on a suit every Sunday, goes to church and in the Word and the Bible and cherry pick scriptures and verses, finds justification to brutalize, dehumanize, rape, pillage, and plunder his property? Frederick is already making the distinction from what he would later call the slave-holding Christianity of the land, using the Bible and Christianity to justify enslaving people versus the pure, peaceable, impartial Christianity of Christ. So what his master predicted is happening. He's becoming unfit to be a slave.
Because slavery is really contra nature. Contra the human history.
Yeah, and there's a
Yes.
story that Frederick writes about in that autobiography, again, when he's about 15 or 16 years old. His enslaver couldn't get him to do the work. He wouldn't listen. He is unfit to be enslaved. And so he sends him to a slave breaker by the name of Edward Covey. And Covey's job was to break slaves, to break them like animals. And Frederick writes that when he gets there, he's hired out to Covey for a year. And Covey starts to beat him and whip him. And then the beatings became more frequent, and then they became weekly. And after 6 months of taking these brutal beatings, Frederick had had enough, and he decided to fight back. And he and Covey had this epic 2-hour battle, which was more of a wrestling match than a fisticuffs, because Frederick knew that he needed to be strategic in the way that he went about beating him. But after that battle, Covey's defeated. They're both huffing and puffing, and Frederick looks at him and he said, "You have seen how a boy has been made a slave. Now you see how a slave has been made a man." And while he's not physically free from the chains that bound him, he was on his way to being mentally free. And as I said, he would eventually make that attempt to run away from slavery at 18. He's caught, and then he was successful when he was 20 in 1838.
All right, wow, he is, your great-great-great-grandfather really had that intense, slow realization of what is slavery. And on his own, he understood how contrary to nature it was.
Yeah, and he would talk about that, and I think, that was his importance when he was an abolitionist. He could communicate the inhumanity of slavery in a way that nobody before him could, and he could talk about it from a firsthand account. And when he talks about the encounter with the slave breaker, he said that he reduced me to the level of a brute, to the level of an animal, but there was something in my spirit that wouldn't die. And he rose up, and this really becomes his resurrection story in the book. And he rises up, he fights back, and that really, again, is a moment of self-liberation for him. And then he would eventually run away from slavery with the help of my great-great-great-grandmother, Anna Murray Douglass, who is very important in the story. There would be no Frederick Douglass without Anna Murray. She was the first person in her family to be born free. She was an entrepreneur working in Baltimore as a domestic servant. She and Frederick meet. We don't know exactly how they met, but they meet and they start to care about each other. And she said, Frederick, I don't want our children's father to be a slave. And she said, Frederick, you're not meant to be a slave for life. And so she sees something in this young man. She was a few years older than he was. And she said, I'm going to invest in this. I'm going to invest in our future. And so she sells her personal belongings, including a feather bed. She puts together the sailor's disguise that he would wear, and who knows if he would have had the courage or the wherewithal to run away from slavery had that not happened, and we would be a very different country sitting here today. They were married for 44 years. They had 5 children together, 21 grandchildren. She was a radical freedom fighter in her own right. She was a conductor on the Underground Railroad out of their house in Rochester, New York. So the proximity of Rochester to Canada, she helped to ferry hundreds of freedom seekers to their freedom through their home in Rochester, clothing them, feeding them, making sure that they can get some sleep, get some rest. And so she's a very important person in this story, as well as the whole family. They were a radical freedom fighting collective, and the abolition of slavery, fighting for women's rights, fighting for human rights was the family business.
Okay, everyone, this was 1800s.
Yeah.
All right. And so at that time, they were a team, Frederick Douglass and his wife, Anna.
Yes.
Who was free then and helped him. Can you just explain that? How was he able to fool people and escape to freedom to the north?
Yeah, so
Yes.
there was a plan in place, and I believe that Anna, it was probably not the first time that she had assisted somebody because it went so smoothly, but we're going to get you some free papers of a sailor. We're going to disguise you as a sailor, and because he was working on the ship docks, he knew how to talk like a sailor. He knew the language and the rhythm. And so they were able to get him on a train, and he describes being on that train and being nervous when they were coming to check his papers because he said the photo on the counterfeit papers that he had didn't look anything like him. So he was nervous, but he didn't get caught, and he made it to New York. And then he would write a letter back to Anna, and she comes to join him. She was also a dressmaker. She made a beautiful plum wedding dress, and they got married and took on, as I said, the name Frederick and Anna Johnson. It wouldn't be until they get to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where they would change their name to Frederick and Anna Douglass.
Can you explain how did they choose Douglass from all other names?
Well, this is a story that I love as well. So they get to New Bedford and they stay in the house of Nathan and Polly Johnson. And Nathan Johnson was reading a poem, Lady of the Lake, it's Sir Walter Scott poem. And there's a character in there, last name Douglas with one S. And Frederick wanted to make it unique, so he slapped a second S on it. They loved the name. And so when you're spelling his name, your audience members as well, make sure you put on that second S because that was the name that he chose for himself.
All right. So Lady of the Lake is the story of King Arthur. And so it was written by
Sir Walter Scott.
Sir Walter Scott, okay. And the Douglas was one of the knights.
Yes, he's a Scottish character in there.
Okay. So it's Frederick Douglass, but the last S is double. That's how you differentiate Frederick Douglass.
That's right.
Yes, wonderful. And I wanted you to also explain to everyone. There's so many pictures of him. And can you explain how come he had so many pictures of him in his great suit?
Yes.
Yes, and well-combed hair.
He was the most photographed American of the 19th century, and that was by design. At the age of 22, so only 2 years removed from slavery, he understands that this new technology that he would come of age with, photography, he could use to help make his arguments for liberation and equality in addition to his oratory and his writings. And he was very smart. And in his first photograph, he was about 22, 23 years old, and he's looking directly into the camera. And again, that was by design because he wanted to counteract the notion in the public consciousness that people of African descent were not worthy of freedom, were not worthy of citizenship. You had people in the North talking about it being a benevolent institution. They're better off in slavery. They're savages. Listen to the happy songs they're singing. And Frederick said, when you look at a photograph of me, you're going to look me in my eyes and you're going to see that I am a man worthy of freedom, worthy of citizenship. And he also said, I'm never going to look like a happy, amiable fugitive slave. And so by design, he would take these photographs because he wanted people to see his humanity. And there are, I believe, about 168 photographs that have been discovered about him. And I was very honored to work on the book Picturing Frederick Douglass, which was published in 2015, where we made the case that he was the most photographed American, photographed more than President Lincoln, more than Ulysses S. Grant, more than General Custer, and his only contemporaries in the whole world that were photographed more than he was the British royal family. So he was very smart in the way that he went about doing it. But I just think it was just brilliant to be so young and to understand that he could really change people's minds through imagery.
Yes. So for everybody, because there was just an emancipation by President Lincoln, there is a great effort to diminish, the black race or the people that are just free. And so there are caricatures of this and that. And so it was very, very intentional on the part of Frederick Douglass to present himself in good suit, dignified as a man. I am a man.
Right.
Yeah.
Present himself in the way that he wanted to be seen. Also at that time, there were racist caricatures that were out there that were showing black people as less than human with tails or with exaggerated facial features. So he's planting himself right into the middle of that, and he's saying, look at me, I am a man. And when he begins to publish his paper, The North Star, which was the leading abolitionist voice, it was published in Rochester, New York, he used to give away pictures of himself, not because he had a big ego and he wanted people to have pictures, but he knew that they would take those photos and put them up on the wall. And they would start to see him as a friend, as perhaps a family member. And so if you got a subscription to the North Star, you were also going to get a picture of Frederick Douglass.
That's brilliant. So the North Star is really representing Canada. Isn't it? The North Star not representing. For those who are fleeing slavery and have to go to Canada, their guide is the North Star. I mean, that's,
Yes. Yeah, that's
yes.
When you look at the history of the Underground Railroad, we hear the North Star as kind of this guide, this mystical guide, but also a guide that you could look up in the sky. But, there were times when it was cloudy. So which way do you go? But it's a story that I think was very important to Frederick Douglass, that he would name his paper the North Star.
The North Star. Okay. Always, his goal was always to lift up his people, to tell everybody else, we are just like you. We are Americans.
Yeah.
Isn't that more or less?
Yes. Yeah, oh, absolutely. He was a founding father of the Second Republic after the Civil War and after Reconstruction. And he was a moral authority. His voice mattered. And even during the great conflict of the Civil War, his spirit and just his guidance, his wisdom rose above all of that. And he was able to speak to the nation with a moral consciousness that the nation needed at that time. And quite frankly, we need now. People ask me all the time, if Frederick Douglass or Booker T. Washington were here today, what would they say? What would they think about, where we are in the country and in the world? And nobody can really say for sure what they would say. We don't know. But I always say, because their blood flows through my veins, I take liberty to say that I think that they would be somewhat pleased that we have made progress. We did elect an African-American president. We recently had a female president of color. I think they would look at that and say...
Vice president,
yes, thank you, of color. And I think that they would look at that and say, yes, that's been progress. And while it's slow and incremental, It is progress, but I also think that they would be outraged that there's still so much work to be done. But Frederick Douglass gave us a lot to contemplate. He wrote 3 best-selling autobiographies. He wrote a fictional novella called The Heroic Slave, which most people don't know that he could have had a career as a fiction writer had he not had other important work to do. And he also published essays, thousands of essays and articles in his papers. So his words speak to us today. And I say, unfortunately, many of what he wrote is still as relevant today as it was all of those years ago when he first penned those words.
All right. Everybody listen. His work is still on Amazon.com, I would think.
You
Are they
find
being
it
printed?
anywhere, yeah.
So the first one is the autobiography. Could you just
Narrative,
give?
yeah.
Yes. Could you just give again those titles?
The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave.
Okay, that's the first one.
First one, 1845, and then the second one was published in 1855, and that is My Bondage and My Freedom. And then his
My
third,
bondage.
My Bondage and My Freedom.
And My Freedom. Okay, that's the second book he wrote.
And then the third one was Life and Times of Frederick Douglass.
Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. At this time, with all of the turmoil, violence, and upsetting our democratic system coming from the White House, I think each one of us should start reading again Frederick Douglass III autobiography and a novella. What is the novella?
Heroic Slave.
Heroic Slave. Okay,
Yeah.
so that's a novella. So, and also for all of those listening, please understand, education is key to freedom.
Absolutely. Education is key to freedom, and we spend a lot of time in schools. I'm the co-founder and president of our organization, Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives, and our primary work is human trafficking prevention education in K through 12 schools. I mentioned at the start of our interview that I wasn't always connected to this legacy, and there were a lot of reasons for that. I had seen what the pressure had done to those that came before me. The way that the families came together, the Washington and Douglass families, happened on my mother's side. My mother's mother, Nettie Hancock Washington, is Booker T. Washington's granddaughter, and my mother's father, Frederick Douglass III, is Frederick Douglass's great-grandson. So my grandparents met in 1941 at Tuskegee Institute, which is a school that Booker T. Washington founded in 1881 at the age of 25. They happened to be on campus the same day.
This is the grandson.
Grandson Frederick Douglass III, my grandfather, and then Nettie Hancock Washington, Booker T. Washington's granddaughter, is my grandmother. So my grandparents met. My grandmother was rushing to meet friends, and they literally bumped into each other, didn't know that the other descended from an historic family. They fell in love at first sight and wound up getting married 3 months later.
3 months later, what about that, everyone?
So there was some divine intervention there too. And then my mother was born, Nettie Washington Douglass, and she's the first person to unite the bloodline. She was an only child, or is an only child. And so I have the honor and privilege and blessing to be the first male to carry the dual lineage. So that's a happy love story. But there's also tragedy in my family. My grandfather, Frederick Douglass III, the namesake of one of this country's greatest heroes, he was a surgeon, brilliant man. People expected him to be an iconic leader like his great-grandfather, and he always walked around with this weight of expectation on his shoulders. And so walking around with people expecting him to do great things like his great-grandfather, but there's only one Frederick Douglass. And when my grandmother was 3 months pregnant with my mom, that weight became too much for him to carry, and he took his own life. And so my mother was born without a father, raised without a father. And then when I came along, and my younger brother and sister, my parents, grandparents, great-grandmothers wanted to kind of put up this hedge of protection around us. So I was really, as I describe it, decisively disengaged from my lineage until Providence called in my life. And that was in 2005. I read a National Geographic magazine, and the cover story was 21st Century Slaves. And it was an article about human trafficking existing all over the world, including right here in the United States. And I had read about trafficking, but I always thought about it in far-off places. And that article just shocked me, that slavery still existed today. And there was one night that changed the trajectory of my life. I was reading another article about a 12-year-old girl who was forced to be a sex slave in the brothels of Southeast Asia. And down the hallway, I could hear My daughter's getting ready for bed. My older daughter, Jenna, was 12 at the time, and my younger daughter, Nicole, whom you met earlier today, was 9. And they were getting ready for bed. They were laughing. They were getting down on their knees to say their prayers. And I'm reading about this 12-year-old girl, and my mind just starts racing, and I can't wrap my brain around what I'm reading and what I'm hearing. And I remember thinking to myself, that's what young girls and boys should be doing, is getting tucked safely into bed and not being forced into bed to service some sick individual. And when I walked in to say goodnight to my daughters, I had this moment where I couldn't look them in the eyes. And I couldn't look them in the eyes and walk away and not do something about this. And it was almost immediately that everything started welling up inside of me and bubbling up to the surface. And I realized that I did have this platform that my ancestors had built through struggle and through sacrifice. And perhaps we could leverage the historical significance of my ancestry to do something about this. So on one side, the legacy of Frederick Douglass as the great abolitionist, and on the other side, the legacy of Booker T. Washington as the great educator. Aha, abolition through education. How could we unfit communities to allow slavery to exist and thrive? And it was through education. And so my mom and I started Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives in 2007. We're a Rochester, New York-based nonprofit charity. And as I said, our primary work now is human trafficking prevention education in K through 12 schools. And I believe we have the most comprehensive education program that exists anywhere in the world. It's online training of educators on how to recognize signs of trafficking, what red flags to look out for, and then certification so that teachers can teach age-appropriate curricula in the classroom. And we also work on federal legislation. There's a piece of legislation that guides how the federal government responds to trafficking domestically and internationally. Initially, when it was enacted, it was called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act in 2000. It gets reauthorized every 4 years. And in 2018 was Frederick Douglass's bicentennial. And we were able to get it named for Frederick Douglass and then to add primary prevention language to the legislation. So it's now called the Trafficking Victims Prevention and Protection Act, Frederick Douglass Act for short.
Meaning to say it's now a law of the passed by Congress.
Passed by Congress, and when it was passed, writing prevention language into the legislation, for the first time, money was appropriated through the Department of Health and Human Services that went to nonprofit organizations that are doing primary prevention education. And prior to that, there was really no funding for prevention because most donors or foundations give to help rescue, restore, rehabilitate the victims and survivors of trafficking.
Wow, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Morris. That's yes, trafficking, because originally I came from the Philippines. Mm-hmm. I know very well that that's still a huge scourge, for poorer countries.
Absolutely.
Yes, thank you. If you don't mind, there are some questions coming from the audience.
Oh.
Okay, this one comes from Ryan V. Tell us the moment you realized modern slavery is alive today and how that revelation became your life's work. You said a little bit about it, but yes.
Yeah, and I think that in just kind of, fleshing out the story a little bit more, it was such an impactful article. And whenever we talk to students, we always talk about, your voice matters, use your passion, your intellect, your talent, your creativity to work on those issues that you're most concerned about. Now, we want them to be concerned about eradicating trafficking, but I've had students tell me that they want to eradicate poverty or homelessness. They want to fight for the rights for women and girls. And so that moment where I read the one article, it changed my life completely. At that time, I was a business owner. I owned my own advertising and marketing company, which catered to the travel industry. But now with this new information and this new calling in my life, all of that changed. So just that one article, and I've never met the person that wrote it, but it changed everything for me and hopefully for the people that we're helping.
Yes. For those who are keeping close touch to their inner promptings or soul, or close to God, there will be moments like this, like Dr. Morris, where something just strikes you, almost like God talking to you, and then you just pursue it. Don't ignore it, right? Thank you. Good question, Ryan. Mm-hmm. Now from Carla B. Can you tell us about one patient whose recovery truly moved you, a story that reminds you Why do you this work? Do you have a story?
I have, there are lots of stories. I like to think about really the stories of education because we work on the front end, so we're preventing it. There are organizations that are doing very important work that are working on the back end. They're helping to rescue, restore, and rehabilitate victims. But when I think about stories, I remember when we first started our work, I was in Albany, New York, and I was talking to a group of teenage African-American boys in a barbershop. And I told the story about Frederick Douglass, how he wrote in his first autobiography that he was always so hungry as a slave child. He always had this pit of hunger in his stomach that would never go away. And on occasion, when he would get food, the overseer would take cornmeal mush, throw it into a pig's trough, and all of the children, including Frederick, would crawl on their hands and knees as fast as they could to try to eat what little food was in there. Now, if you go back to the story that I told about him trading bread or biscuits with the children, the hungry children in the Baltimore neighborhood, the students will say, so Mr. Morris, what you're telling me is he would rather feed his mind and have his stomach go empty. And so I'm telling this story to these young men in the barbershop, and this kid raises his hand. He said, Mr. Morris, if I could just tell you what's happening in my mind, it's like it's a pitch black hallway. There are no windows, no doors, no way out. I don't know which way to turn, and I have no hope. But the story that you just told me about a young Frederick Bailey teaching himself to read and how important that was, you have now shown just a little bit of light into my mental darkness, and now I have some hope. He's articulating this. I mean, it's so beautiful.
Wow.
And he said, now I know which way to turn. I know which way. I know how to get out of this. There's another situation with a young girl, 10 years old, and I was talking about my family and my relationship, and she's bouncing up and down in her chair, and she's trying to get my attention, and she's raising her hand, and I finally call on her, and she said, I want you to know that I researched my family tree, and I found that my four greats grandmother, I thought I had a lot of greats, was born into slavery, taught herself to read and write in secret. She ran away, became a successful businesswoman and a philanthropist, and she knew exactly what that word meant. And so she said, so do you know what all of this means? And before I had a chance to respond, she said, it means I have greatness flowing through my veins just like you do. And I will never forget that.
That's wonderful.
We all have greatness flowing
Yes,
through our veins.
yes.
We all stand on the shoulders and walk in the shoes of those that came before us. And history lives in each of us. It doesn't just live in me because I descend from two people that we've heard of, but it lives in each and every one of your audience members that are listening and watching. And when we think about this idea of carrying our history forward, what will our great-great-great-grandchildren say about us 150 years from now in this moment in time in which we find ourselves? Are we on the right side of history or on the wrong side of history? And so, thank goodness, my ancestors were on the right side of history.
Definitely.
I know your ancestors have been on the right side of history. So history lives in each of us, but the future depends on how we carry it forth.
All right. Yes, just for the information, our national hero said, those who cannot look back to where they came from will never reach where you're going.
Yeah.
So it's very important, for that young girl or little girl to say, she was so excited to say, I've got, what did she say?
She said, I have greatness flowing through my veins. And, it's funny how things happen. So you just talked about the importance of knowing our history. We need to know where we come from in order to know where we're headed.
going.
What I'm wearing today, and I wore it specially just because I knew I was going to be with you, this is Sankofa. So it's an African symbol, an Andean symbol that represents going back. So it's a bird looking backwards and pulling his history forward. So that's that concept of reaching back for your history and carrying it forward.
And moving forward. Sankofa, all right?
Yeah.
Can you just move that a little bit? There. That's an African bird. It's not really alive,
Right.
but it symbolizes being able to look backwards and then moving forward.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for wearing that. All right. From Jackie M., how do you balance being a descendant of such towering figures while still defining your own path and voice? You sort of mentioned a little bit, but yes, answer it for Jackie M.
Yeah, that's really a tough question. And I think because I found this mission on my own and it wasn't forced on me, it's more meaningful that way. And so I truly believe that God I could look back and see that he was preparing me for all of the other things that I did. So my first career was as a singer, and then was a business person, and now nonprofit executive. And as a nonprofit executive, you have to wear a lot of hats. And so I was being prepared. And while I think it took me a long time to finally start walking in my own shoes, I finally was able to do that. I think if it would have been forced on me, it might have been a very different story or outcome.
All right. So again, Dr. Morris is following what is within himself, and then he finds his calling, which is to fight for or to educate people on this danger of trafficking.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. This is now from Avi H. How can today's young people use their voices as courageously as Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington did in their era? Okay, that's
a really good question. And Frederick Douglass had a great quote. He said, "It's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men." And I would add to that women. Booker T. Washington also had a great quote. He said, "If you want to lift up yourself, lift up someone else." And that's a message about service and giving back. And so when we talk to young people and we want them to know this history, we also want them to see themselves in these stories, to see themselves in these heroes. And another story, I've got all of these stories with students. I remember I was talking to a group of high school students, and I was talking about trafficking and the work that we do, and I could see this young man in the back, and he was just angry about something. And he raises his hand and he said, "Why are you up there talking about trafficking when I was just at 7-Eleven and there were homeless people outside?" And that was his passion. That's what concerned him the most. And so we teach young people to use or harness their passion, but use their talent, their creativity, their intellect, and work on those issues that they're most concerned about. And so young people, through our work, we have a service component, a service learning component, a civic engagement component. So once they're learning about the history of slavery in this country, then they're learning about contemporary forms of slavery and other human rights abuses. There's always a service project tied to it so that they're now back in the community giving back. And so we've had students that have presented at the UN. We've had students that have done podcasts and documentaries. They've done photography exhibits showing what trafficking looks like. We've had students that have trained law enforcement in their communities on how to recognize the victims of human trafficking. So we just want to give them examples so that they can see that their voice matters. And one of the things that I've seen in doing this work for a little more than 18 years is that when young people talk, us older people tend to listen. And so it's just empowering them and helping them understand that, again, their voice matters and that they can affect change in the world around them. And just like Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, Sojourner Truth, Cesar Chavez, pick your freedom fighter of choice, they can affect change for future generations in the same way that Anna planted that seed of thought, that positive seed of thought in Frederick's mind that you're not meant to be a slave. That changed the course of history for all of us. Our interaction here, the people that are listening to our conversation, it will change the course of history. The ripple effects will go throughout history. So we just want to inspire them to believe that they can be change agents.
How do you define freedom today, not politically, but personally and spiritually? Okay, that's heavy.
Yeah, that's definitely a heavy question. And I can really just define it for myself and what that means to me. And that's a spiritual freedom and intellectual freedom, being able to do the things that I want to do, love the people that I want to love, be able to raise my family and hopefully make a little bit of a difference in the world. And so for me, that's freedom.
And the most important thing is that what you have in front of you, think of service rather than just thinking of yourself. This is especially for the young people. If your ancestors, Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, could see America today, now, what do you think each of them would say?
Yeah.
Wow, that's from Kenneth A. Named after you. Okay.
And I think I kind of addressed that a little bit earlier, that I think that they would be pleased to see that there has been progress, and they would expect that there would be progress. But they would also be outraged, I believe, that there's still so much work to be done, and many of the challenges that they faced we're still dealing with. And so I always look back to my ancestors. I think about them every day. I hope that I'm making them proud. And everything that we do at our organization, Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives, is to teach about and lift up their lives and legacies and their importance, because we want young people to know who they were. Both of them were two of this country's greatest and most influential heroes. Yes.
So for those, please go on his website, and can you please give the website so that if they are wanting, if anyone listening would like to help you and join you because they have nothing better to do, please give them your website.
Yes, our website is FDFI.org, and that's the acronym for Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives. Please visit our website, click on the Our Initiatives tab. We are proposing to build a museum in Rochester, New York, dedicated to Frederick Douglass and Anna Marie Douglass and the Douglass family, and that's going to be about a 6 to 7 year project. We're in the preliminary stages right now in doing our due diligence and our feasibility and environmental studies on a few parcels that are on the Genesee River, which was an important waterway in helping freedom seekers get to Canada. So that's a significant project that we can use support on. We also have a publishing imprint with Simon & Schuster and Forefront Books, where we're publishing and amplifying voices of people of color that have stories for the world, and a whole bunch of other things. We're working on media projects, so check us out.
All right, for all of those wanting to help, and then a book imprint from?
It's called Frederick Douglass Books, distribution through Simon & Schuster, and it's a partnership with Forefront Books, and we're very proud of the books that we've published so far and the writers that we're working with.
All right, so there you have it. On Amazon.com, get his biography.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yes. So thank you. You heard it from Dr. Morris, the great-great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass and the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. This is the Loida Lewis podcast. Let's live, love, laugh, and learn together. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
The Loida Lewis podcast, hosted by Loida Lewis, is produced by the creators of Over a Glass or Two, Jesse and JV, executive produced by Laura Nicholas Olace. Rate and review us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts for a chance to be featured on a future episode. Have a question for Miss Loida? Just email us on askloidalewis@gmail.com. Your question might make its way to a future episode. Subscribe on all major platforms to never miss a beat. Thank you for listening to the Loida Lewis podcast. Let's live, love, laugh, and learn together